Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.43, Preparing for 1777. When we left off last time, we had just wrapped up the 1776 campaigns, as George Washington's army scored a handful of key victories throughout New Jersey. Although these were not the kind of wins that were necessarily going to turn the war, they did provide the Americans with a nice morale boost at the end of an otherwise awful year. This week, we are going to tie up a few loose ends, like the Northern Army that was still up near Canada, and bring everybody to the same place for the start of the 1777 campaigns, which we will begin to cover next week. With the Continental Army in their winter quarters in Morristown, and the British in theirs in New York, everybody finally had a moment to gather their collective breath. For the Americans, fear of the enemy was replaced with the fear of freezing to death. However, even for Howe and the British, things in New York were far from easy. Although everybody had moved into winter quarters, that did not exactly mean that the British were free to relax. One of the features of the American Revolution is that not every belligerent was officially with an army. There are plenty of examples of Americans who were not directly associated with the Continental Army, taking matters into their own hands and harassing the British. In New York, this manifested itself as food shortages, as bands of American rebels would make life difficult for the British trying to find something to eat. It was not the army that was going hungry, however, but rather it was the civilian population of New York, who had chosen to remain loyal to the crown. While the British troops and their leadership often spoke of offering protection to the Loyalists, that did not necessarily mean that they were providing the Loyalists with comforts. The soldiers got their food. The remainder of what existed was fair game for the local populace. This will not be the last time today that we talk about the British through a mixture of negligence and indifference, seemingly making their best efforts at driving the Loyalists over into the American camp. Although the British were not out harassing the Americans during their time in Morristown, the Continental Army found themselves being harassed by a different kind of enemy entirely. Smallpox was a constant source of misery for the Americans, and one that Washington could really do very little about. An inoculation process did exist. However, here we really do need to be careful to not conflate that process to the more modern process of vaccinations that we all know today. The process of inoculating a person against the illness came with a nearly month-long period of recovery, and did carry some real risk that the person could still die. If Washington decided that he was going to make the inoculations mandatory, it would have crippled his army. If Washington decided not to do anything at all, the disease might run through the army and kill half of it off in its wake. Ultimately, that February, Washington made the decision and ordered his army in Morristown to be inoculated. Although it was a risk to the security of the army in that moment, how much worse would the situation have been if an outbreak had come during the campaign season? Right now, the American army at least had the relative security that Morristown provided. If there was ever a moment where the American army could take the risk, this was it. Really, though, the biggest challenge for Washington during that winter was the fact that so much of his army just evaporated away. Recall from last time that a lot of the men had agreed to stay on for just a little bit longer, with some extra cash helping to convince them to finish up the 1776 campaign that had bled over into 1777. Now, however, the campaign season was over, and although it had been fun, people quickly decided that they had had enough soldiering for one day. This is to say nothing of the men who just up and left without any kind of official leave. Part of the problem for the Continental Army came from the largely ineffective recruiting process. Following the defeat on Long Island, Washington had managed to convey to Congress the need for a professional army, an army that had enlistments longer than a year, to avoid this problem in the future. Although Washington did win the point, having Congress agree to a professional army and having them actually provide it were two very different things. Well, men were more likely to agree to fight for a local militia. They were far less excited about the prospect of heading off to fight with the larger Continental Army. Congress had wanted to keep the Army as a completely volunteer force. However, by the time that April rolled around, it was abundantly clear that such a volunteer force was simply not working out. The usual inducements for service were made, generally manifesting in bonuses and promises of future lands. Yet, the idea of having to sign up for the Continental Army to go off and fight a British Leviathan was just not that enticing of a prospect. On April 14th, Congress accepted that things were not working out and made their recommendations to the states that they begin drafting men for service. Now, importantly, notice here that Congress requested, rather than demanded, the institution of a draft. This meant that, although the states would eventually get on board, initially the progress was painfully slow, with all that hesitation from the states that one would expect. Although a draft would eventually help fill the ranks, that is not to say that men could not be convinced to join up, as Washington did have an army of approximately 9,000 men in fighting shape by the beginning of May. Well, Washington was busy trying to get something into place resembling a fighting force for the 1777 campaign season. He found himself preoccupied with the question of exactly what Howe was going to do next. As we saw last time, by the end of 1776, Washington had managed to push Howe back to just a few remaining strongholds within New Jersey. Were the British going to come storming back through New Jersey and ultimately move on to Philadelphia? Were they instead going to move to the north along the Hudson and cut off New England? Washington spent much of his winter months with his officers trying to answer this question, which continued to elude him. The truth is, however, that the British themselves seem to have been less than clear on exactly what their plan for the war in 1777 was going to be. Throughout basically the rest of today, we are going to spend our time looking at the British plans for that year and getting a real understanding of the fundamental failures that the year would bring for the British. Before we can move forward, however, first we need to look backwards a bit. The last time that we checked in with our army up in Canada, they were stranded on Illinois, trying to figure out what to do next. When the Americans had reached Illinois the previous summer, conditions had been appalling. Of the 7,500 or so troops who were stationed on the island, half were either wounded or sick. The conditions on the island itself were far from sanitary, so disease spread like wildfire throughout the men. The problem for the Americans is that they could not exactly wait around to recover their health. Illinois was always going to be a temporary respite for the men, as the British, albeit cautiously, were moving in their direction. Likewise, as of July 1776, it was no longer going to be Philip Schuyler calling the shots in Canada, as Congress had decided that a change in leadership was needed, thus promoting Horatio Gates to the command. With Canada now lost, the new goal of the American leadership was finding some way to secure Lake Champlain. Now, for those of you who have listened to the entire show thus far, the American position is essentially the reverse of the situation during the French and Indian War. If you will recall, during that war the British forces had moved north, from Fort William Henry across Lake George to Fort Carillon, now Ticonderoga. From there they moved on to Crown Point, then Illinois, before finally meeting up with everybody else at Montreal. During the Revolution, we have seen the troops repulsed back from Quebec to Montreal to Illinois. As was the case during the French and Indian War, control over Lake Champlain was critical, as it would help limit the ability of the British to easily move supplies inland into New England. Much as it was for the French all those years before, Illinois was never meant to be the fortified location, where you could make some gallant stand, but rather was a rallying point where maybe you could slow down an enemy force a little bit. On July 7th, General Schuyler, who was still in control as of that moment, made the call to retreat back down to Ticonderoga, a decision that Horatio Gates was on board with as well. The sick and injured would continue moving down to the southern bank of Lake George. Both Schuyler and Gates agreed that, geographically, Crown Point would have been the better place for a defensive line to be formed. Crown Point stood at a choke point in Lake Champlain. The Americans could dig in and cause serious damage to the British ships attempting to force their way past the fort. Likewise, Crown Point was constructed facing north. Ticonderoga, when it was built, was facing south, as the French were worried about the men at Fort William Henry. This means that the strongest fortifications of Fort Ticonderoga were along the southern portion of the fort. However, now the British were coming from the north, leaving the fortress dangerously exposed. Making a stand at Ticonderoga was going to require far more extensive work in order to secure that location from the British advance. Unfortunately, despite the advantages of Crown Point, the fort really was nothing more than a charred ruin. The Americans had hardly the time nor the manpower to rebuild the fort. So, would Crown Point have made for a better final stand? Yes, probably it would have. However, pragmatism dictated that the men would instead fall further to the south to Ticonderoga. The job of getting the men off of Illinois and down to Ticonderoga fell to Benedict Arnold. Philip Schuyler and John Sullivan were going to continue down to Philadelphia, while Horatio Gates would land in Ticonderoga, where he would take command of the fort. We know from last time that ultimately Sullivan would end up alongside Washington in Long Island, before he went and got himself captured. At Ticonderoga, Arnold would find himself reporting directly to Gates, launching a relationship that would become so completely defining to Benedict Arnold. The British, under Guy Carleton, were not exactly sitting by doing nothing. Carleton was cautious and was moving very deliberately towards the American position. For the British, the plan was always to get their ships down into Lake Champlain. However, this proved to be a problem. The British warships were not going to be able to proceed through the rapids of the Richelieu River, which meant that they had to stop, build smaller bateaux, a kind of flat-bottom boat, in order to move the army through the river and down towards the lake. The warships were then literally taken apart and moved piece by piece around the rapids. The entire process took until September, allowing Arnold and the Americans ample time to move to their new position at Ticonderoga. Arnold was well aware that the British were coming by boats down Lake Champlain, and he hurried up to get his own, albeit small, fleet into the lake. As it turns out, disassembling their entire fleet took some significant time, and it was not until October 11th that the British and the Americans' fleet met at Valcour Island in New York. Now, I want to be clear about a few things when I use the term fleet, as I fear that I might be too generous. Arnold had some ships under his command. However, this is nothing compared to, say, the British Navy. Also, if you are sitting there saying to yourself that you had no idea that Benedict Arnold had any naval experience, that is because he had no naval experience. Located in far upstate New York, Valcour Island is located just south of Cumberland Head. The island is close to the shore, with Hero Island located to its east. Valcour is much closer to the New York coast, which is specifically why Arnold chose it. What Arnold was betting on is that the British, eager to get south towards Ticonderoga as quickly as possible, would just do a speed run past Valcour Island. As they had a larger fleet, they would take the path along the eastern side of the island, where there is far more open lake. If that happened, the British would have to swing around and would suddenly find themselves fighting upwind, giving the Americans far more flexibility of movement. The plan worked perfectly. The British, still moving downwind, blew right past Valcour Island, not realizing until it was way too late that the Americans were lying in wait. As Carleton was now forced to swing a quick U-turn, his fleet found itself vulnerable to the American broadside attacks. By the time that Carleton was meaningfully able to fight back, it was nighttime, and Carleton, being ever the cautious one, decided to hold off until morning. This delay allowed Arnold to move past the British and start moving his men back towards the south. Over the course of the next day, now October 12, Carleton did gain the upper hand and absolutely smashed the American fleet. However, generally this occurred when American ships realized that they were going to be outrun. They grounded themselves, they burnt the ships, and then continued on foot towards Ticonderoga. Despite the damage to the ships, the vast majority of the troops under Arnold's command did survive the battle. All of this would, however, prove to be rather pointless, as Carleton decided that, being in the middle of October, it was too late to do much about the Americans anyway. He pulled back, abandoning Lake Champlain, and leaving the Americans firmly in control of Ticonderoga, at least for the time being. It is easy to give Arnold credit here for driving the British off and saving Ticonderoga in 1776. Although his small fleet had been mostly destroyed, he had certainly caused Carleton a headache. He should also get some credit for having so few casualties from the battle. It is also noteworthy that Carleton and the British were now bailing out of Lake Champlain entirely. Historian Woody Holton, however, is skeptical that the battle had much of an impact on the British. He points out that the Battle of Valcour Island only took 2 days, which was not exactly a significant enough amount of time to justify the British deciding that a further campaign this late in the season was impractical. So then why did the British decide to pull back? Here, unfortunately, we are left to speculate Carleton's reasoning. The best guess that I can offer is that, as we have seen, Carleton was not exactly a risk-taker, having conducted himself very cautiously so far in the war. While Arnold's fleet may not have really slowed his advance down that much, it did take him by surprise. For a cautious man like Carleton, it may well have convinced him that American resistance was going to be stiffer than he had initially anticipated. If this was enough to cause him doubts that the capture of Lake Champlain was going to be a quick and easy venture, it might help explain why he decided to pull back and put off the offensive for another year. Regardless of why Carleton pulled out of Lake Champlain that October, the end of 1776 saw the Northern American Army taking up a position at Ticonderoga, preparing for the inevitable British advance on their position that they all knew was going to be coming the following year. Coming back to that initial question of today, what were Howe's plans? We can now really look at his options. To his south was the American capital in Philadelphia. To his north was the American army now at Ticonderoga, which was standing between him and his own northern army up in Canada, and was preventing him from linking up and cutting off New England. What Howe truly wanted heading into 1777 was to find some way that he could pull Washington into a major engagement. This should come as little surprise. Howe had been concerned for a while about the British ability to defeat the Americans, should the Americans fall into essentially a defensive posture. This fear had become galvanized back in 1775, following the British defeat at Bunker Hill, when it became clear the damage that the Americans could cause if they chose to fight from well-fortified positions. Meanwhile, Howe had every advantage to be gained from a large-scale engagement. The Americans, when fighting in an open field battle, had shown themselves willing to break and run, should things start to go sideways. If Howe could just get the Americans into a general engagement, maybe he would be able to bring all of this independence nonsense to an end with a single decisive blow. Howe did what he could to goad the Americans into a battle. By mid-June, he had moved a large number of troops into New Jersey and started them marching towards Philadelphia. Surely the Americans would have to confront an army moving on their capital, right? As it would turn out, no. Maybe a year earlier, in 1776, Washington would have pushed the army into that massive engagement. Recall that the prior winter outside of Boston, he had been chomping at the bit to attack the British in the city. Now, however, Washington more fully understood what it was going to take to win the war. The American Revolution was not, and really could not, be a war of decisive battles. American hopes of victory in the war were pinned on keeping an army in the field and fighting that war of posts that had emerged the previous autumn. As much as Howe was looking for a huge victory, Washington was content keeping his engagements limited to skirmishes and harassment. In 1777, Washington refused to take the bait. It was not as though Washington was indifferent towards the potential loss of Philadelphia. However, in this situation, he had keenly observed that Howe had brought none of the necessary equipment with him to indicate that he actually had plans to cross the Delaware River. Washington had, correctly, concluded that Howe's objective was not to take Philadelphia, but rather was a feint to pull the Americans into that open field battle, something which Washington had no intention of giving him. When it became clear that Washington was not going to bite, Howe pulled his men back to Amboy. At this point, Washington believed that the British were getting ready to evacuate back to the safety of New York. Washington, wanting to stay close to his enemy, ventured out of his camp, moving the army in Howe's general direction. Now it was the British who saw their opportunity to take advantage of the moment. Rather than sailing, as originally planned, on June 25th, the British moved out of Amboy towards the suddenly exposed American army. Howe's plan was to quickly surround an American army, under the command of Lord Stirling, while swinging around and cutting off Washington's ability to retreat. Unfortunately for Howe, the men sent to attack Stirling, who were themselves under the command of Lord Cornwallis, found far more resistance than they had anticipated. The Americans were able to hold up Cornwallis long enough that Washington figured out what Howe was doing, and quickly was able to fall back and secure his own path of retreat. That was it. By winning a seemingly small skirmish against Cornwallis, the Americans had successfully prevented the British from getting that open field battle that they so desperately wanted. Knowing that he was not going to get the decisive battle that he needed, Howe proceeded to abandon New Jersey and pull back to New York. Of course, Howe was not done for the year. He had a plan that, critically, did not involve marching through New Jersey, because all things considered, the British were pretty sick of hanging out in Jersey. Despite his earlier movement being nothing more than a feint to pull Washington into an engagement, Howe really did have his eyes set on Philadelphia. However, rather than getting there on foot, it was decided that his men would move first to New York, board ships, and then sail south into the Delaware, and then ultimately into the American capital. Now, as it would turn out, General Howe was not the only person making plans for 1777. Back in London, George Germain, the Secretary of the Southern Department, was busy working up his plans for 1777 as well. Germain had taken over for Lord Dartmouth back at the end of 1775. A particularly rigid man in his approach, Germain brought with him an inflexibility that mixed poorly with a meekness that often kept him from fully expressing himself. Germain was not sitting around by himself either, scheming up complicated battle plans. He indeed had company, as the year before, General John Burgoyne had decided to skip back to London to advocate his own case. Not that this was going to be a hard sale for Burgoyne, because conveniently for him, Germain and Carleton hated each other's guts. Burgoyne, if nothing else, had a very ambitious plan for not just himself, but really for the entire war that year. Having been with Carleton for the failed trip down Lake Champlain that fall, Burgoyne used the loss to promote his own vision. What Burgoyne was advocating for was a more aggressive push to the south, moving out of Canada, with the end result being the complete separation of New England from the rest of the colonies. Burgoyne, unsurprisingly, would be at the spearhead of this plan, as he would move his army through the Hudson River Valley until he reached Albany. A second army would simultaneously move west from Oswego towards Albany, arriving at the same time as Burgoyne. So then, what of Howe's army? Burgoyne never really mentioned Howe all that much, nor was he terribly interested in having somebody come and steal his glory. This was going to be his moment in the spotlight. Germain, though not exactly vocal, was less confident than was Burgoyne, and believed that, considering that they were fighting the same war, the two men probably should coordinate their plans. However, Germain did little to advance his own thoughts here. Historian Robert Middlecuff, whom, as a very brief aside, I accidentally referred to as Robert Middleton back in episode 4.40, so sorry about that, writes at length about the failures here of British war planning. Germain failed to make his concerns over the planned mission known, and really just tacitly went along with it. Burgoyne's plan seemed overly complicated and ambitious, and as Middlecuff points out, Burgoyne's plan lacked any real answers about what happened when the two armies converged at Albany. Sir Henry Clinton, who was also in London at the same time, also appears to have believed that Howe and Burgoyne should probably know what the other is doing. However, once again we see a British senior officer keeping his opinions to himself. Not that Howe seemed to really care what was going on to his north. His eyes were firmly focused on Philadelphia. Although he would have loved an open field battle to deliver that decisive and, hopefully, fatal blow, Howe also recognized that this was not that kind of war, and that Washington was not going to fight the way that he wanted. Instead, if he could disrupt trade and cause widespread disruptions, maybe that would be enough to make the Americans grow tired of the war and fall back into the king's embrace. What truly is completely baffling here is that Howe and Germain were in regular communication. The men wrote each other frequently, and yet Germain said absolutely nothing at all. Howe had expressed to Germain that he did not believe that the war would end in 1777, and was fully preparing London for what he believed to be a long, drawn-out affair. Germain likewise had been aware since that winter that Howe had his eyes on Philadelphia, but he never saw it fit to mention to Howe that Burgoyne was now commanding the troops in Canada, nor that there was any kind of plan in place that would see the isolation of New England. Howe, the highest-ranking officer for the British in North America, truly had no idea what was happening to his north. By the time that Howe shared his plans with London, that the invasion of Pennsylvania was going to come by sea, Clinton and Burgoyne were already in the process of crossing the Atlantic to kick off their plans for the year. Even once Howe became aware of the Burgoyne mission, and the fact that London was making at least a recommendation that he help out, Howe remained completely uninterested. By the time that he learned that Burgoyne was going to be attacking from the north, it was June, Howe had already decided his course of action and was getting everybody ready in New York for his planned invasion of Pennsylvania. Howe, upon learning of Burgoyne's plan, basically just shrugged his shoulders, said that it sounds cool, and then promptly got back to work on his own plans, otherwise ignoring what was going on to his north. This decision not to share information was not even all that abnormal. British military matters in the 18th century involved a whole lot of people making a whole lot of plans, while simultaneously attempting not to step on anybody's toes. This ensured that at all times proper decorum and respect were paid, while at the same time limiting the fallout should things not work out as planned. Should, for example, Howe get crushed by the Americans in Pennsylvania? Well, that was on Howe. Likewise, should Burgoyne's plan fail and stall out, that failure was not on William Howe. He had nothing to do with the plan. The problem with this delicacy, however, meant that the giant British army was not acting as a single cohesive unit. The left hand often had no idea what the right hand was doing. As Woody Holton puts it, London did not issue orders. They issued recommendations. That way, when plans failed miserably, the leadership was insulated from said failure because they had never issued such an order. Although Germain would recommend to Howe that he might want to reinforce Burgoyne, he certainly would never have done something so dramatic as issuing an order to Howe. Therefore, when Howe openly stated that he would not be helping out in Albany, it was not as though he violated an order. Rather, he declined a recommendation. Burgoyne arrived in Quebec on May the 6th and promptly handed his orders over to Guy Carleton, letting him know that it was now Burgoyne that was in charge. The army that Burgoyne was taking over had approximately 8,300 men in total, a mixture of regulars, Germans, Canadians, and Iroquois. With his eyes now set to the south, Burgoyne prepared to march to what was sure to be an easy victory. We are going to leave everybody here for now. With the British campaign of 1777 now set, the plan for George Washington was going to be one of survival. Keep his army in the field, avoid large-scale engagements, and take his shots wherever he could get them. That was going to be the order of the day. As we move through 1777, I would like you to keep this episode in mind. When we wrap up this year and examine why the war was going the way that it was, many of the decisions by the British that we saw this week are going to help explain the direction of the war. Next time, with everybody now in place to resume fighting, we too shall pick up with the campaign of 1777. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as the fighting resumes.